watching Property TV.
Hello, I'm Stephen Galpin, and for this edition of Spotlight we're going to be looking at buying property in France. Joining me is Joanna Leggett, co-founder of Leggett Immobilier. Joanna, welcome.
Thank you, Stephen. It's nice to be here.
Do you know, it's a year and 2 months since we sat here discussing what was going to happen to the markets after COVID and after Brexit.
Yeah.
So let's start off. How is the market?
Well, the market in France at the moment is very, very strong. The properties are just flying off the shelves. Where we used to take 6 months to a year maybe to sell a house, we're seeing 2 or 3 buyers putting offers in on the same property. So for buyers looking, make sure that you are in a position to buy, because there will be other offers coming in. Particularly in the French market, we've only just started to see the Brits and Americans coming back into France, because obviously they haven't been able to travel. Having said that, the market's completely changed in the ways people buy. We have actually done about 25% of our sales this year have been done virtually. So whereby everything's been done online. We've done videos, we've walked around WhatsApp viewings, with the client on the phone. All of the paperwork can be done by DocuSign, so it all goes through, which is quite funny, because I mean, if we think maybe 20 years ago, I wouldn't even buy a pair of shoes online, but now people are buying houses online. So it's totally changed the way the market is. The other differences to the market is, since obviously the pandemic, we're seeing so many city people moving out to the countryside, which has started to push the rural areas prices up. Where they've always been fairly stable, we are seeing different areas going up in price, because people have realised, A, they can work from home, so they want a bigger property with outside space. They're moving out of the cities where they may not have any outside space, or they're commuting. We've seen a lot of Parisians who maybe had a big apartment in Paris, have sold their apartment in Paris and got a pied-à-terre and are buying a big country house out in the southwest, for example, where you can commute, or Brittany, where you can commute by the train, within under 2 hours. So that's made a big difference to the market. And to be honest, we would have thought that we would have had a very, very difficult year, but we've actually had our best year in 22 years.
Wow.
So I think interest rates being very low in France for the French mortgages is also making the first-time buyer market grow as well.
How difficult is it for somebody from the UK to get a French mortgage rather than... I tell you why I asked that question, because if you ask a broker over here, how do I fund the purchase of a French property or an overseas property, 9 times out of 10 they'll say to you, well, why don't you take a second mortgage on your UK property and fund it with cash? I presume really that's because they earn their fees in this country and therefore it's...
To be honest though, it's a lot more difficult since Brexit to get mortgages in France. There's a minimum amount now. Some banks won't lend anything under 150, so you're going to be having to look at quite a lump sum mortgage. Some banks are around 100,000 and some won't do it at all. So it's a lot stricter and the criteria is a lot tougher than it used to be when we were in the EU. So that might be the solution, that you do an equity release or you have to take a second mortgage on a UK property and then become a cash buyer in France. I mean, they're still available and there are still certain banks that we can put you in touch with, but it's not as easy as it used to be.
Okay. Well, nothing's easy in
No,
life. It always gets harder. It never
Yeah.
gets easier. Okay. And how is this affecting sort of house price inflation in France? You say you're very busy. Is it pushing the prices up?
It's pushing, certain areas. I mean, the Alps has seen the biggest price increase. They're up about 7%. Paris was 6.4%, but even in the rural countryside areas, we're seeing rises of 3 and 4%. And bearing in mind, we haven't seen any rises in rural properties for years, since the crash. So it is affecting the market, and more so that where we might have had 16,000 properties for sale, we're down to 8 because we can't replace the stock as quickly as it's selling as such. So it is a seller's market at the moment.
I always think agency is hard. You're like on a hamster wheel, aren't you?
Yeah.
Because you sell something, you got to get something else to sell.
Exactly. And because everybody is moving and it is a fast moving market, you can't get them in as quickly as you sell them.
Did you find that during the COVID lockdowns, people were going to their holiday homes in France to work and work remotely?
It really depended because there were slight windows where there were gaps and you were allowed to travel, but unless you had an actual reason, you weren't actually even allowed to go to France.
Right.
Just for a holiday or holiday reason, you'd actually have to have a really good reason to be able to travel. Yeah, some people, when they had those windows, would come over and then stay in France. I've got a lot of friends that work in London that were in France the whole time, in their holiday homes or with parents, etc., that were staying there during the COVID.
But that would now cause a bit of a problem with the visa situation, wouldn't it?
Yes, now we've got the visa problem. I mean, unless most of the clients we're seeing at the moment want to become full-time residents, so it seems to be much more of a residency thing than it is a holiday home market at the moment. That could obviously change. But yeah, if it's a holiday home, whereby you used to be able to stay up until 180 days, if you go over that, you become a fiscal resident in France. So you'd have to have residency. Now you're only allowed to stay for 90 days. So you could stay for 90 days, then you have to leave for 90 days, and then you can come back in again. But that's for the whole of Europe. So you couldn't just go 90 days in France and then pop over to Spain for 90 days. You have
Right.
to leave Europe. So the only way of getting around that, if you own a holiday home, it's a lot easier because you can apply for a long stay visa, which you can do from the embassy before you leave the UK. And that can extend. But again, once you go over 181 days, you're then a tax resident. So you would only be able to stay that amount of time
Sure.
on a visa.
So you need to mind your P's and Q's now then.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, well, that's good. Are you finding that since, I mean, our government tell us we're coming out of COVID, I'm not quite so convinced at 50,000 new infections a day,
Right.
but are you finding any difference in the type of person that's buying now to say 12 months ago or 2 years ago?
No, I think it's exactly the same. I mean, France has become a little bit more popular because people don't want to fly. And so obviously coming from the UK, you can drive over to France in a day. Whereas if you're going on to Italy or Spain or wherever else, you're looking at an overnight stop. So we have seen an increase, I would say, in British buyers that may have perhaps pushed on or got flights. I mean, the flights are back, but they're not as frequent as they used to be.
No.
So the train is always a good option, and it's very fast from London. Or you can drive over, of course, and there's so many different ferry ports, which is the entry point, even if you were heading on to Italy or somewhere else.
And fuel costs in France?
There's not much difference to here, to the UK. There's not
Presumably
that much
you
difference.
got some though, have you?
Yeah. The French don't read the press, so they wouldn't be going looking for more petrol.
I do wonder if the
Although we did run out of toilet rolls in the COVID.
Did you really? Okay. Well, I think we did here, didn't we?
Yeah.
But no, I was just wondering whether I wonder whether the price of flights will rise significantly. I mean, I was looking on the news this morning, and Heathrow were trying to almost double the landing costs for planes.
Really?
And I think they've had their knuckles wrapped by the government, and it's gone to some committee or other. But I wondered if flying will be more expensive just as a result of
At the
all this.
moment, it's really cheap. I mean, they're trying to get people back into planes, and so all the flights that I have taken myself, coming backwards and forwards to the UK, have been really cheap. But they're not as frequent. So where you might have a flight every day, there might be 2 a week now.
Yeah.
So it depends on what day you travel to which airport you need to go to.
Yes. Okay. Pound seems to be getting stronger, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What's that going to do for you?
Well, that's great for the buyers, obviously, that are buying in France, because it gives them more value for money, so they can buy a bigger property because it's quite high. Obviously, for British buyers that might be moving back, it's not so good because they're going to get less pounds for their money.
I can't see why you'd want to come back.
Yeah, no. Well, it's quite surprising because most people don't. They don't come back. Most of the Brits that we sell as well move around France. So they might go and buy the big dream and all the land and everything else, and then realise that we don't want to be sitting on the Ride on Mer for 4 hours every week in the summer because everything grows. And so they might have bought somewhere that's been too isolated, and then they decide, actually, we're getting older now. We want to be nearer a city where we've got the hospitals and doctors, and they move into towns or village houses with less work, because us Brits do tend to go for the lovely old stone walls and chateaus even, but the upkeep of them is quite a lot.
Yes. There's not such a thing as a perfect dream, is there?
Yeah, no. Well, I think the French just laugh at us because particularly in the rural areas, you'll see they'll sell off their old barn to a Brit. Now those Brits, they're going to renovate that. They're going to have dust everything and blah blah. And they buy these little shoebox bungalows, that are no dust and all completely heated and
Yes.
insulated. And they must think we're all completely mad.
Well, I've done similar in this country. I had a place up in the Midlands, and by the time I'd gone up, mowed the lawn,
Yeah.
done whatever with the rest of the house, it was time to go
Exactly,
back
so
to
to go
London.
back, yeah, yeah, and that is the problem. I mean, and obviously the climate changes so much. Last summer we had 3 months with no rain whatsoever in the Dordogne area. This year we've had a lot of rain, but obviously still a lot of heat as well. But it's just made everything grow. So you're constantly cutting back, and grass is growing and everything else. Whereas last summer it was brown, and it didn't grow at all.
Okay. All right, well, that's all we've got time for in this half of the show. After the break, I'm going to be talking to Joanna and ask her to give us a virtual tour of France.
You are watching Property TV. You are watching Property TV.
Hello and welcome back to Spotlight Part 2. Joanna, last time we spoke, you took us on a wonderful verbal tour of France, starting at the ferry point in
Calais.
Calais,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
So take it away.
Well, if you're looking at buying in France, France is the biggest country in Western Europe, so it's huge. And what that basically means is that whatever region you're buying in, it's going to change. The architecture is different, the climate is different. So you've got to really narrow down what you're actually looking for. And obviously the budgets vary from north to south, depending on where you are. So if we started up in Normandy and Brittany, they've always been really popular with Brits because it's easy. You can pop over for a weekend, or you can go backwards and forward if you need to see elderly parents.
Let me just stop you there. What's now the most efficient way to get over the channel or under the channel?
Well, there's the quickest way is probably the Channel Tunnel train. So drive onto to drive on the car and come straight across. It's only half an hour crossing. You've also got the ferries, which you can do, and there's also the airports. So there's flights all over France. But coming up into the north, the type of architecture you'd get, say in southern Brittany, for example, is a lot of slate roofs and sort of stone granity type buildings. In Normandy, you get a lot of colombage, which is like the thatched cottages, and they sort of come down in towards Calvados. Price-wise, in sort of those sort of areas, you'd be looking at maybe €130,000 for a 3-bedroom home. As you come further down, you've got the Loire Valley, and you come into the central part of France. In the centre region, that's the cheapest area. So the Creuse is the cheapest area to buy. So if you're on a really small budget, but you want a big house, the average house price there is €63,000 for a 3-bedroom house. So that would be a good area, and it's halfway down France in the middle. Then you come across to the areas like the Charente-Maritime, the Charente, the Poitou-Charentes, and the Dordogne. The Charente-Maritime has become extremely popular with French, because whereby the French might have taken a second home in perhaps Portugal, since the COVID, they're all buying in France so that they can go there within a day and in their own country. So that has pushed the prices up quite a lot in the Charente-Maritime, and there's not a lot of stock there. It's not a lot of availability. Things are getting sold very quickly. The Dordogne is really good value for money. The Brits love the Dordogne. It's very much like the Garden of England. Beautiful scenery, beautiful buildings, beautiful villages. Hence why it attracts so much attention from Brits. And there you'd probably be looking at, 150 would get you a really nice 3-bedroom house in any of those areas. If the closer you get to the coast, the more expensive the properties will be. So inland, they're going to be a lot better value for money. Then we come south of France. The south of France, meaning the Languedoc-Roussillon areas. They're lovely. You can be in Spain or in Andorra. It's right on the border of Andorra and Spain. So the architecture there is slightly different. Whereas in the Poitou-Charentes, you'd have things that are known as like maisons de maîtres. So they're like dolls' houses with a door in the middle, and they'll have outbuildings buildings which would have been used for cognac or wine. And when you get down into the Languedoc-Roussillon, it's much more Mediterranean style. So you'll have like coloured buildings and vineyards and miles of vineyards. And you've obviously got the Provence, which is where all the lavender fields are. But it is the south of France, and so the prices are higher there. In the Languedoc-Roussillon, you'd probably be looking at around 180,000 for a 3-bedroom home. Then if you go across, from sort of going across Saint-Tropez and then going into the Côte d'Azur areas, again, the prices, that's very much an international cosmopolitan area. And so if you were looking at, for example, for a 3-bedroom place in Cannes, you'd be looking at over 300,000. So it really depends on, you know, how long you're going to be using it. The good thing about the Côte d'Azur, though, is if you're going to rent out your property, it's a much longer season. If you're further north, you'd be looking maybe April to September, but obviously down in the Côte d'Azur, that's a lot milder. The winters are a lot milder as well, so that you can rent it for a longer periods of time. Yeah, of course. Then we could go up into the Alps, the Rhone Alps. That's some of the best skiing in Europe for all the different ski resorts. There is a new train that's going to be going from London St Pancras directly into a Eurostar train that will be going directly into these ski resorts, which is going to make them really, really popular, because what a nice way to travel. And again, there you'd be looking at around 350 for a 3-bedroom house. But if you're in resort and in a chalet, you're going to be looking at over $1 million. However, the good thing about that is the Alps is a really good area for investment, because you have all year round, whether it's the summer months where you get a huge amount of tourism, also in the ski season. So if you don't like skiing, you use it in the summer and rent it out to the skiers.
I used to live in Switzerland for a period of time, and I really loved it. And the summer months are just beautiful, aren't they?
Yeah.
The air's clear.
Exactly.
It's
And then there's also the cities. I mean, there's some beautiful cities in France. Bordeaux, we have an office actually in Bordeaux. Absolutely fantastic city. And from Bordeaux to Paris, you can do it in 2.5 hours now. I live near a city called Angoulême, which is in the Charente. And again, from there to Paris, it's a 6-hour drive, but it's 2 hours on the train. So that's also pushed the prices up in those areas, because Parisians are all coming out and buying properties in the countryside. So it has made quite a difference to the rural properties.
Yes. Come back to the skiing for a moment. And of course, I would imagine, I'm sure you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine there's much better value buying in France as opposed to just over the border in Switzerland.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the property prices in Switzerland, and obviously France is so much nicer. But but yeah, I'm not sure. I think Switzerland is more expensive, and France, there's a lot of variety. So you've got lots of different resorts which will suit everybody's budget. So if you don't really have a big budget, you could go to a resort that isn't as highly priced as some of the ones, you know, that are more popular.
Now, we're very lucky because we're talking to you here and you're giving us a really good graphic view of everywhere. And we've just done a quick tour of France in an amazing amount of time. Now, if I was uninitiated, wanting to buy somewhere in France, wanting to understand these areas, and I wasn't lucky enough to have an agent as competent as yourself, how would I judge the areas? Is there a go-to place to look at?
Well, I definitely do your research, because as I said before, France is such a big country. It varies completely from climates, etc. I mean, we always have a lot of information on our websites anyway, but I would definitely try to do some recce trips. You know, go out there for a weekend, spend some time in the area, you know, look at what your budget is, because you know, if you come down to Cannes with 100,000, you're not going to get anything. So you've got to be realistic with what you want and what your criteria is, and then look at the areas that suits. There's the Notaire de France website, which is the notaires put all of their figures in. So that will give you average house prices across the whole country. So you could look at that to get an idea. Do as much research as you can online. There's lovely tourist sites which will show you all the pretty things in the villages and things like that as well.
It sounds like if you look at the Notaire's site, if you actually set your budget first, that's probably quite a useful thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think the budget is the budget and the climate, because obviously some places are going to be very hot and you might want warmer or you might want cooler, etc. But also what you want to do life-wise. If it's a permanent move, you've got to be careful that you don't buy in a tourist town that's shut in the winter, because if you're going to be living there permanently, you want it to be a working village where there's a community and it's not you're the only person in the village and everyone's gone back off their holiday.
You're going to want your doctors and your dentists and your supermarkets
exactly. So you need to, I've always suggested to clients to pick a city that you like, so say whether it's Bordeaux or Angoulême, and draw a half an hour circle map around that and then look at those areas, because then you know if you need a hospital you're only half an hour away or something like that, but you're actually still out in the countryside, so you're not having to live in a big city, but you can be in a big city in a short period of time.
Yes. And again, your location should, I suppose, be partly governed by whether you are required to drive or not.
Yeah.
Just coming on to that subject, is there anything we should know about driving in France or buying cars there?
Well, if you are going to be living in France permanently, you'll have to change to a French license, I believe, but if they keep changing the rules, so we're not 100% certain. And I would definitely buy the car in France, because otherwise you've got to redo the plates and everything else, and that does
Well,
cost quite a
it's
lot
the
of
usual
money.
Brit thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, you want to take your car with you and you want to take
Yeah.
your garden shed with you.
Yeah. Well, there's all the tax thing now.
Mm.
That's become a problem, because the removal companies are turning up at the port and they're getting taxed because of the, you know, if you've bought a new piece of furniture, you've got to pay the import tax.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that never happened before. You could come over with your garden shed, but now you probably get taxed on your garden shed.
Right.
So it's probably better to start again and buy it in France.
Well, as we said before, nothing's easy, is
No,
it?
no, or anywhere in Europe for that matter.
Yes. No, I think if you're going to move to a new country, you need to be part of that country and,
Yes.
and you know, deal in the commodities that are
Yeah.
there, I think.
And also the language. I mean, France isn't like, so a lot of countries in Europe, they all speak English, but in France they don't, particularly if you're in rural communities. So, you know, it's really important to try and learn, even if it's just a few words, but to get by and to take some lessons. You obviously pick it up while you're in France. If it's a holiday home, it's not so bad, because you're not going to be there all the time. But if you're moving there permanently, then it would be really important to try and learn the language.
Okay. So just to finish off, the real hotspot in France at the moment?
Well, this is the funniest question. We've got over like 700 agents, and each one of them will tell you it's their area.
Right, okay.
Because that's why they live there and they love it. Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the rural countryside properties is what's selling a lot at the moment, because people now want a home office, or you know, they want the outdoor space and they want to be able to commute into cities. So those are the type of properties that are sort of flying off the shelves at the moment.
Yes. I quite like what they did in Barbados last year, which is give a 12-month permit to people who wanted to go and work there for the COVID period.
Oh, really?
Which I thought was
That's a great idea.
quite
yeah.
novel, a good way of getting investment into the
I
country.
can't see Macron doing that, but
No, but I think we'll keep our feet on the ground and stick with France at the moment.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, Joanna, thank you so much for coming in to see us, and that was a most enlightening trip around around France. And I do hope business carries on in a successful way for you the rest of the year. Thanks for coming in. So that's all for today. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Spotlight.